Okay, good afternoon. My name is Chris Blackman. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. On behalf of the Office of Public Affairs, which administers the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism at Yale, I'd like to welcome Andrew Mwenda, and I'd like to welcome all of you to, and thank you for coming to hear Andrew speak. There used to be a time when you couldn't work in East Africa without hearing what Andrew Mwenda has to say on every topic imaginable. He is on radio, he is in the newspapers, he is on the lips of conversations in the street. Everywhere he goes, he stirs up controversy. He speaks truth to power. He speaks truth to the somewhat powerful. He speaks truth to the less powerful, to the powerless. He'll speak truth if you're willing to listen. And I'm glad that you all are here today. I said you used to just hear me in East Africa. This is because you now hear him all over the world. He's increasingly one of the most vocal and influential and thoughtful voices outside the foreign aid establishment on foreign aid. This year, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the 100 most influential global policy thinkers in the world. And he was one of the very few Africans to make the list, and certainly one of the very, very few Africans not a former head of state. His former book, which you're going to get a taste of today, you'll hear about again. Hopefully we see it out next year. And in some sense, that's exactly the reason we invited him here to come to Yale for the semester, is to lock him in an office, make him stop talking, and get him to write it all down. So the Poynter Fellowship brings distinguished journalists to campus and has given Yale students a unique opportunity to learn more about the world of journalism and its role in society. And I think Andrew's going to give us a very unique perspective on journalism in its role in society. Journalists as public intellectuals, as political activists, and indeed he's among the most distinguished journalists in Africa. He's the founding managing editor of The Independent, which is Uganda's premier current affairs news magazine. He runs Andrew Mwenda Today. Is that the correct title of your radio show? Something like Andrew Mwenda Live. That's right. With roughly, I think 2 million listeners in a country of 30 million is not too bad. And so he's one of the main and major sort of mainstream news personalities in Africa. He's the former political editor of the Daily Monitor newspaper, and in Uganda and in Africa, he's been an outspoken voice for liberty. This has landed him in jail. It's seen his articles and his newspapers suppressed. It's seen his publishing interfered with at every turn by the state. He has won many awards, including the International Press Freedom Award from the International Committee to Protect Journalists. There's going to be a brief Q&A section following the talk. If you'd like to ask a question, these microphones will be on either side, and I think we'll be able to pass them through the audience. I'm also happy to say Andrew is around until the end of April, so we have him for the entire semester, and I'm sure he'd love to hear from you if you want to continue the conversation that we start today. And just so a quick note, this event is being video recorded. So a quick reminder to turn off your cell phones, pagers, and other miscellaneous electronic devices. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Andrew Mwenda.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that generous introduction. Chris didn't tell you that among the other things on my CV is that I faced 23 criminal charges in Uganda with a cumulative jail sentence of 115 years. So if I was jailed, I will come out in 2125 AD in time to find my president running for his 28th term of office. Right now, he has done 6. The topic for my presentation today is paved with good intentions, Africa and the curse of foreign aid. Now, I am a journalist, not an academic, and I am trained to tell stories. So I'll begin by telling a story. And at the risk of sounding extremely modest, the story will be about me and my father. In 1993, I passed my high school exams very well, and my father bought me a gift. It was in a huge box. But when I removed the gift, it was a small book by a man called Friedrich von Hayek, and the book was titled The Road to Serfdom. Serfdom is something akin to slavery. And this is what the book had to tell me. Hayek sought to demonstrate the tight nexus between politics and economics and argued that centralized planning of economic life would inevitably undermine political freedom and lead the West, or the Western world, towards totalitarian government. Hayek was concerned to the threat posed, the threat to individual liberty caused by economic insecurity in the Western world after the Great Depression, and how it had given socialism ideological ascendance in policy-making circles. Many people at that time argued that they needed the governments to intervene in markets in order to correct market failures. And Hayek found this argument extremely utopian and argued that it ignored the vital role of markets in determining or finding people's new wants. And he always argued, towards the end of the book, that we should always, as much as possible, try to rely on the spontaneous forces of society rather than on commanded decisions by governments. And his most important insight was that serfdom, which was totalitarian government, would not be brought to Western Europe or North America by the evil actions of evil men like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, but by the cumulative effect of actions of well-intentioned people whose actions would always be generated by immediate necessity, but whose long-term impact was to undermine the basis of freedom. Now, Hayek may have overstated his case in favor of the market and against the state, but I wanted to use the story of what I learned from Hayek to come to my subject of discussion, and that is the international movement towards increasing financial assistance to poor countries, because this movement is based on the idea that the advancement of society is not a product of the spontaneous actions of individuals in the marketplace, that the advancement of society is based on a huge humanitarian intervention by the international community through massive transfers of financial resources from rich countries to poor countries. And these resources are channeled through the state. I am deeply suspicious of this new argument in favor of something they call a Marshall Plan for Africa. Now, I should introduce the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a massive injection of financial resources into Western Europe after the Second World War by the United States. Many observers say that this Marshall Plan succeeded. Now, I am extremely skeptical about the achievements of the Marshall Plan, but since I do not want to sound like I'm this skeptic who refuses the international and global consensus, let me accept that the Marshall Plan helped Europe reconstruct after the Second World War. But the context of the Marshall Plan was different in the following ways. One, the Marshall Plan funds were not given for the development of Europe, of Western Europe. They were given for the reconstruction of Western Europe after the devastation of the Second World War. Two, Europe had already undergone by that time, 1945, 1946, 1950, Europe had undergone two major transitions. The transition from an agrarian or agriculture-based economy to an industrial-based economy. And with it, an associated transition, the transition of most people from living in rural areas to urban areas. Three, Europe by that time had developed skills in terms of the spread of education and knowledge, but also Europe had acquired technology. Europe had also acquired the social infrastructure of a capitalist society. In other words, capitalist norms, habits, practices had penetrated the social consciousness of the Western person, or the Western European person. Finally, the Second World War had destroyed the physical infrastructure in Europe. but the social infrastructure of skills, technology, capitalist norms, habits, and others were still within the society, even capitalist institutions. Now, today, let us look at Africa. Most Africans are rural, not urban, and most of them depend on agriculture, not industry, for a living. There is limited human skill because the spread of education is limited, and the diffusion of modern technology is very scanty. Agrarian norms, habits, and practices still dominate the social consciousness of our societies. What then has been the result? Precisely because of the context that I presented in Europe, the Marshall Plan funds, which were only 2.5% of the GDP of their largest recipients, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, were able to spur rapid transformation. On the other hand, since 1960, Africa has received on average foreign aid to the tune of 13% of its GDP. Every historian, even a poor historian, will tell you that this is an unprecedented transfer of financial resources from rich countries to poor countries. Now, this is the paradox. After 50 years of massive transfers of money into these poor countries, the continent of Africa has grown poorer, not richer. Well, let me not say the continent. Most countries in Africa have grown poorer, not richer. In spite of this practical evidence, there are still loud voices that are saying that we should increase aid. I am suspicious that that approach is like saying that the patient is getting worse by this medicine, and the solution is we should give them more of it. Now, before I go into why I think aid has been destructive to Africa, in spite of the good intentions that underpin it, I want to present the following caveats. One, when I say Africa, I am actually excluding South Africa, Botswana, Namibia to the south, and Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria to the north. Largely because the Arab countries to the north, I don't understand their politics very well. And these other countries in the south, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, have their politics is organized differently. The second caveat, the countries I will be referring to are a large and diverse group of countries with different cultures and traditions and sometimes different politics. And therefore, I will be making sometimes sweeping generalizations. But I will ask you for the following favor, that the generalizations I make, for every generalization I will make here, I am 100% certain that there will be some exceptions, divergences, and what I would call counter-narratives. Now, with those caveats in place, I will try to get one thread around the organization of an agrarian society that can carry through all of these countries. There is a second challenge to the argument I am going to make. How do we explain the outcome of foreign aid in countries like South Korea and Taiwan and Botswana, which used aid, where let me put it this way, where these countries were able to transform rapidly in spite of, or possibly because of, the presence of aid? And then how do we balance that against Somalia, Liberia, Zaire, my own country, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and all these other countries which have grown poorer in spite of, and I want also to add, also because of huge influx of foreign aid. To conclude on my caveat, I want to say that my argument is that aid in and of itself is not a bad thing. Aid is just one input among so many other variables that operate in a poor country. The impact of aid on any country is determined by the internal organization of its politics. How is power organized? How is power exercised? And how is power reproduced in that country? It is in understanding those three that we can be able to understand the negative consequences of aid on African economies. Let me map a picture of how power is organized in Africa. And I will begin by telling a story like any journalist would do. In 2003, I visited the former president of Zambia. Zambia is a small little country in East Africa, in Central Africa. And the president at the time was called Frederick Chiluba. And we sat over a meal of rice, chapati, and wild game. Delicious. And he started telling me, at that time he had left power and he had installed somebody to replace him. That person was called Levi Mwanawasa. Unfortunately, he died in office about 2 years ago. Chiluba told me that Mwanawasa had gone to parliament and removed immunity on him so that he can be tried for corruption when he was still in office. And he felt a big sense of betrayal that this guy whom he had made president could do something like that to him. Why? In the mid-90s, a man called Mwanawasa, who later became president, had gotten involved in a bad accident. And Chiluba had been informed that he's about to die. And out of his own kindness, Mr. Chiluba put Mwanawasa on a plane, evacuated him to South Africa and later Britain, where he received first world treatment. And it is on the basis of that high-class medical care that this guy's life was saved. And Chiluba felt that for Mwanawasa not to reciprocate that act of generosity and kindness, saving his life, was very un-African. Why did Chiluba say that? He continually said it was an African. And I have spent 5 years thinking, why did Chiluba say it is an African? If you look at the organization of a peasant society, I think that because of peasants are human beings who depend on agriculture for a livelihood. Agriculture depends on nature for its survival, in most cases, especially in African countries. The vagaries of weather have always forced peasant societies to adopt certain social norms in the organization of peasant society. Reciprocity, work sharing, extended family systems, personal assistance in times of need are social arrangements that peasant societies put in place in order to ensure themselves against the risk of crop failure leading to famine and starvation. If you pick that value system, a peasant who has no food will go to a well-off neighbor and ask for assistance. The one who will not have medicine, who is ill, will go to a well-off neighbor and ask for assistance. Within the value system, the moral universe of the peasant society, the peasant will expect that the neighbor or the friend or the in-law will help. That is the expectation. The neighbor who is well off will respond in helping that peasant because to do otherwise would attract gossip and social sanctions in form of, there will be negative gossip and other social sanctions like reduction in reputation. People will look at you as a bad and heartless man, you did not help a neighbor. This moral universe has powerful implications on how politics gets organized. For then, when you introduce it into politics, where politicians have access to state power and have access to money, then they can use public resources to extend private generosity to people whose loyalty and support they need. Now, in most African countries, when governments collect taxes and when donors give aid through the state, it creates an opportunity for elites to use this aid selectively to build a political following, rather than invest in building functional public institutions that can ensure an impersonal application of public policy. You know, if I am an American and I fall ill and I'm totally poor, you have something here called Medicare or Medicaid, whatever it is called, I see it on TV, but I would go to a hospital on the basis of my claim to citizenship, I'll get a service. If I need a road in my area, I'll go to I will participate in the local council where I stay, and the road will be delivered. In other words, the benefits that the state confers upon the citizen are given through an impersonal application of public policy by institutions that are built on rules. This system, and I think this is the biggest challenge our continent is facing, how can we foster incentives for governments to develop a vested interest in building functional public institutions that can deliver public goods and public services through public institutions or political institutions impersonally to anonymous citizens. But let me come back to the organization of this politics. Now, if a minister is in charge of the healthcare system, he will steal half the budget, and his other colleagues will steal another half of that budget. Or he will steal a quarter of the budget and others will steal another half. Finally, only 25% of the total health budget will go to the health sector. Most of it will be appropriated by individuals within the state. And don't make this mistake. Most people say that the corrupt in Africa steal this money and put it on their Swiss bank accounts. That is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that this money is used then to extend private generosity to individuals and groups whose support and loyalty a politician is looking for. So the dysfunctions we see at the level of institutions, because institutions are starved of funds, or the funds sent to these institutions are stolen by private individuals, these institutions remain dysfunctional. But if you come to think of it, dysfunction is not the way the system fails. It's the way the system works. It provides opportunities for those in power and for those subject power to use personal connections to benefit from corruption. How? A politician who needs support from a given community will use the stolen money to extend private kindness and generosity to the community. On the other hand, elites who could challenge this kind of practice realize that it is much more profitable and less costly to negotiate privately with a powerful individual in the government for resources rather than to organize resistance against the state. Because resisting the state is costly. You can be arrested and thrown in jail. Your family members who have businesses, they can receive the tax auditors the next day. So it is much cheaper for me as an individual elite in Africa to go to the president and supplicate so that he can have my mother put on the presidential jet and evacuated to Germany for treatment, rather than go and organize a newspaper to be criticizing this kind of system. And it is through this kind of relationship that the governments in Africa are able to secure individual compliance with the practices that are collectively harmful. But it is also the strategy through which governments in Africa are able to fragment resistance to the Amis rule. Now, having given that very brief organization of politics, how power is organized and exercised and reproduced, let us shock this model with aid. Here comes the international cartel of good intentions with a lot of money from American taxpayers and says, here, Mr. Andrew Mwenda, you're the president of Uganda, you have $1,000 million, which is $1 billion. You have $1 billion. You are putting a hyena in charge of the meat market. Or you are putting Dracula, I don't know whether all of you know hyena, but possibly you know Dracula. You are putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. So here is the challenge. With this kind of organization of politics, where dysfunction is the way the system works rather than the way the system fails, how do we think about aid and how to change these countries? And this is moving me to my conclusion. I strongly believe that the greatest catalyst to change are threats. When the governments are threatened, when elites are threatened, they are forced to change their bad ways. These practices we have talked about are economically costly. One, they destroy roads so people cannot trade. They destroy the education system, and therefore you cannot have an enlightened population, a skilled population that can support economic growth. They destroy healthcare, and when you have a diseased population, they cannot work and produce more. So the costs of these practices has been to stifle economic growth in Africa. When economic growth begins declining, governments are starved of revenues, because remember that the governments collect revenues from taxation, and if you will get a high tax yield if you have a huge output in the economy. When the economy shrinks, you will have less tax revenues. Governments, elites in Africa and the governments in Africa are insured against the destruction of the domestic economy by a huge influx of foreign aid. Elites in Africa are protected from paying the political price of their economic stupidity by the subsidy called international aid. Why is there a huge political price for economic decline? Governments everywhere in the world need money to survive. They need money for the simple thing of organizing law and order, basic law and order. And our governments are quite dictatorial in Africa. They need money to pay the army and the police to clobber the opposition. They also need money to buy off elites, as I have told you, to bribe elites for their support. But they also need money for some bit of welfare in order to win legitimacy and acceptance in the eyes of the vast majority of their citizens. If the source of this money for their own fiscal survival is to be generated from the domestic economy, these governments would be driven by self-interest to govern in a more enlightened fashion, to listen to their citizens, to have a vested interest in the productivity of their citizens, and therefore sustain robust institutions and productive economic policies. The second thing, first is aid tends to reward those governments. It props governments that have destroyed their domestic economies by providing them an international subsidy. The second thing, because aid is channeled through the state, it tends to increase the economic attractiveness of politics and therefore the profitability of controlling power. When politics and power become the most profitable economic activity in a country, especially our societies that are ethnically heterogeneous, then you'll have every ethnic group competing to have access to the foreign aid pie. And that makes the struggle for entry into politics or into power a matter of life and death. Finally, aid tends to disarticulate, from what I've explained, to disarticulate the relationship between the state and the citizen. How? By making the governments dependent on foreign donors for money, they make these governments lose interest in the productivity of their own citizen. The result is governments stop looking at their citizens as people to whom they should be accountable, but they look at them as clients whose loyalty they should buy using foreign aid dollars. Equally, the citizens stop looking at the government as an institution or the state that they should hold to account through their own actions, and they begin looking at it as a patron on whose generosity they depend for their livelihood. How do we change these countries? I just want to conclude by coming to the role of threats. The role of threats in forcing governments to change. And I will tell a story about these threats. In 1999, December, I went back home to Uganda for Christmas. I was a student in England, so I went to Uganda for Christmas. And I decided to make a telephone call to our president so that I can go and see him before the century ends. And he was generous to me and gave me audience. So we sat that evening, the 31st of December, 1999, and and then I asked him, but Mr. President, you have one major problem. Since you came to power, the army has always remained almost like a private institution to you. Why don't you professionalize it and make it a national institution? And he told me a story that has remained on my mind for many years. He said, look, when we came here in 1986, that's when our president came into government, he had come to power through a guerrilla war, and therefore the army he had was not really a national army. It was a personal guerrilla army, which he needed to transform into a national professional institution. He said, we started sending a number of our officers to Cuba for training so that they can come and build the officer corps of a national professional army. The problem is that every time we sent these officers, 40 to 60% would be returned. Why would they be returned? Because they had HIV. And then one day, this is the time when HIV is beginning to ravage Uganda. He said, one day, President Fidel Castro of Cuba called me and said, Yoweri, that's the first name of our president, Yoweri, your army is in serious danger. It is going to be wiped out, not by the bullets of the enemy. Our president was facing a rebellion in the northern part of the country. Not by the bullets of the enemy, but by the scourge of AIDS, HIV/AIDS. And the president told me when he heard that story, he realized that really he had danger. He could easily be overrun. Now at this time, his political party, called the NRM, had a very weak and shaky political base. The instrument of his rule was the army, which he had used to capture power. So if this army is wiped out by AIDS, he would lose power. The threat of loss of power made him think. I do not know whether any one of you has read about AIDS, but Uganda is the one country in the whole world that designed the most effective AIDS or HIV preventive measures you can find anywhere. We put in place institutions, put in place policies that, because this is a disease that did not have a cure at that time, there were no ARVs. the most important thing was to campaign for prevention. Condoms was distributed through schools. Our parents, African cultures have taboos. You can't talk about sex. All of a sudden, there were national campaigns in Uganda to encourage parents to talk to us about sex. I was a young man of about 14 years then, and my mother had to call me and sit me down, and we had to discuss sex. So cultural taboos were broken, institutions were put in place, policies and campaigns were everywhere, billboards. It was AIDS and prevention of AIDS was advertised like Coca-Cola on billboards, on television, in newspapers. If you go to East Africa, I think Uganda has the most liberal newspapers. We have a newspaper called the Red Paper. You should look it up in the newspapers, rather on the internet. So the role of threats. The second threat I could mention is Rwanda. In 1994, the little country of Rwanda suffered a genocide. The people who captured power in Rwanda are the ethnic group that were victims of this genocide. These guys had stared mass extermination in the eye, and very few of them had survived, but part of their survival was to capture power, and Roy saw it from the ethnic group that was trying to kill them. They learned that the price of failure is very high. They cannot afford the luxury of incompetence and corruption that you find in most of Africa. So if you go to Africa today, you will find that Rwanda has one of the most effective public administration systems anywhere in the world. Its systems are as efficient as you would find, much more efficient than the US, as you'd find in Switzerland or Sweden. So we should appreciate the role of threats, that governments in Africa have been protected from staring regime collapse in the eye through an influx of foreign aid. And as a consequence of these things, we have the following. We have the demonstration effect. Because when Uganda started reforming, neighbors started saying, these guys are doing well. What is it that they're getting right? So once you have one country threatened, it tends to teach its neighbors. Right now, all our neighbors have adopted many of the policies, even in regard to AIDS, that Uganda initiated in the early 90s. Reputational capital. When a few cluster of countries begins growing rapidly, international investors begin saying, this country is interesting, we should be going there. So you gain reputational capital. And finally, the final thing is the role of individual and organizational agency. Because whatever the threats Uganda faced regarding AIDS or Rwanda in its post-genocide context, it was so important to have an organization, a political party, and an individual leader, in our case, Mr. Yoweri Museveni, in Rwanda, Mr. Paul Kagame, an individual who can catalyze their organization to promote the desired change. I want to end my presentation there and open it to questions, queries, and criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So there's an opportunity for a few questions. We'll try to pass the mics around, but if you want to, on either side, we can also have them down here, whichever works.
Thank you very much for this most fascinating presentation. I personally have learned a lot. I have a very brief question regarding Rwanda. Do you think that part of the success story was, and please correct me if I'm wrong about the facts, part of the success of the contemporary success story of Rwanda has to do with the fact that the Tutsi, who ultimately came to power, are a minority group in Rwandan policy, so they have to make things work. Otherwise, they will always be resented because they are minority. So, in other words, if they were a majority, would the outcome be a different one? If they were an ethnic majority? Thank you.
Actually, that's my point. That's my point. I agree with you. I am suspicious. I cannot rule out that Hutu, Rwanda is divided between Hutus and Tutsis. The majority are Hutus who almost exterminated the Tutsi. I agree that Rwanda is ruled by a minority, an ethnic minority, that stared extermination in the eye. So they face a strong group threat. That strong group threat imposes on them a strong revenue imperative. They need money to build an effective security system to defend themselves against a violent power grab. So that revenue imperative means that they have to build functional institutions. They have to have productive policies that can ensure sustain economic growth. Economic growth is vital for Rwanda because it generates the necessary tax resources the government needs to defend itself against a violent power grab. But violence, rather coercion, or the military alone cannot be an effective instrument of power. They need the software of rule, and that is called legitimacy. How do you win legitimacy when you are a discredited minority? They need to build good roads, have a functional healthcare system, education system, in order to win the hearts and minds of the majority Hutu. And I think a combination of those two things explains why Rwanda functions like that. But remember that also Rwanda has a history, 700 years of a history of a strong and authoritarian state. Rwanda has always had an effective state, unlike many African countries, and Rwanda was not created by colonial rule. It predated colonialism. So I think that it is possible, even without these threats, that possibly a more productive Hutu president can build on the Rwanda's pre-colonial traditions of an effective state and pursue a much more productive approach. But it would be very unlikely. For the Tutsi, it is very likely. For the Hutus, it would be unlikely. So I agree with you on that.
Hi, and I'm from Tanzania. I have two questions. The first question is about the discovery of oil in Uganda right now, and how does that change, for example, the political game, especially for the case of Yoweri, and does this mean that I just read a few articles days back in which people were criticizing how the contracts for oil were being handled, and the government has refused to be open about them. So how does this new resource that's been discovered in the country change things? And then another question is about, you just said about how liberal the newspapers in Uganda are. But I've been going through several newspapers, and this is in concern with the anti-homosexuality bill, which I'm not so sure if it's passed or not. But there is a strong, as compared to Kenyan newspapers, which tend to be better advocates of human rights, the Ugandan newspapers seem to be very much conservative and, how would I say, not making enough efforts to really push for this one human rights for the LGBT community in Uganda. Why exactly? And I mean, do you think this will change in the next, will there ever be a change towards advocacy?
Thank you very much, my friend from Tanzania. I think, one, regarding oil, Uganda has been depending on foreign aid for nearly 50% of her budget. And the foreign aid has been responsible for the creation of the most corrupt neo-Patrimonio system I know of in Africa, since Moi's and Mobutu's. But this one is much even more elaborate because Museveni is really a smart guy. Thanks be to Dar es Salaam University. So oil is likely to increase state patronage and corruption in Uganda, and even lead to the deinstitutionalization of very many aspects of the Ugandan state. Regarding the Uganda is in parliament, they're proposing a law to hang everyone who is a homosexual and to jail for life anyone who touches another in a homosexually suggestive way. Ugandan society is very conservative, by the way. Conservative to the degree that if you called for a genocide against homosexuals, I am sure 95% of the electorate would vote for that genocide. So it is in this context that you need to understand the Ugandan press. That the journalists themselves would largely be as prejudiced as the audience they are writing for. That is one. And two, as ignorant about sexual diversity as the audience they are writing for. But what has been impressive for me is that actually, if you read the editorial pages of newspapers in Uganda across the board, they have been defending or they are opposed to this law. So I am extremely satisfied. I'm actually surprised that you're not satisfied with the position Ugandan newspapers have taken. You may read articles opinions written by the anti-homosexual coalition, which is very strong, and I think they need to be given a chance. What is important for Uganda is that at least in a society that is extremely conservative, especially on matters of sex, with the exception of AIDS, that we have opened a national debate on the rights of sexual minorities. And that debate, it is through fostering openness and open discussion about sexuality that we can create understanding. And it is understanding that can help Ugandans overcome cultural bigotry and traditional prejudices against homosexuals. And the newspapers in Uganda are doing an excellent job. I think I have written about 3 or 4 columns in my newspaper, criticizing the bill and the wrong philosophical and moral foundations that underpin it. By the way, I speak very fast. When I speak 1,000 words in 1 second, just do like this for me, yeah? So that I speak in a foreign accent. I think a better accent than American accent, but still, you may not be able to understand it. I'm joking. Yes.
Hi. This past fall, I participated in the Faith and Globalization seminar, which was a collaborative effort between Yale University and the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. And Tony Blair was there presiding over our session on faith and aid, and I took the opportunity to bring up the thesis from Dembi Samoyo's book, Dead Aid, which is saying the same thing that you are, that perhaps foreign aid is hurting more than it's helping. And his response to my example is that Africa's problem is not where they're getting the resources. And so, which I was disappointed in, and I didn't get to press the matter further. So with your experience, I guess, communicating with these kinds of people in charge of foreign aid and whatnot, like, what do you think, what steps may be taken to kind of change this mindset and clarify what the real effects are of these good intentions?
I should tell you that I have suffered a similar fate like you. When Tony Blair was still Prime Minister, he formed something called the Commission for Africa, which was supposed to design a new strategy for delivering aid in Africa in a more productive way. And part of the plans, I was one of those who was invited to go and have a meeting with him to discuss how we can increase aid and use aid as an instrument of economic development. And my discussions with Mr. Tony Blair convinced me that he was totally and down to earth. He is a kind man, a nice man, who I advised him, by the way, to read Hayek, that your good intentions in and of themselves are not sufficient to deliver what you want. The road to serfdom, you see this presentation is, Hayek was saying that the road to serfdom is always paved with good intentions. Now you see, I ended my presentation with the last word, paved with good intentions. Africa and the curse of foreign aid. So I think that Tony Blair, among all the proponents of aid, is on the extreme, he's on the left of, should I say the left or the right of Jeffrey Sachs? He's even worse than Jeffrey Sachs. And this experience is from my personal interaction with him. We had a very candid discussion. I found Bono, whom I have had a discussion with, including yesterday, a long telephone conversation. I find Bono much more willing to listen and understand that good intentions in and of themselves are not sufficient. Good intentions can end up propping a very corrupt system. So I am very skeptical about Mr. Tony Blair. But I think that aid can work if the conditions that facilitate its ability to work are right. If you do not have a new Patrimonio organization of politics, you have elites that have a vested interest in sustaining growth, like in Rwanda. As I have shown you with Uganda in the case of AIDS and early economic reform, aid can be a powerful instrument of change. But in most cases, aid tends to reward failure rather than to, tends to subsidize failure rather than to reward accomplishment or innovation.
This is something I'm curious about. You described the sexual conservatism in Uganda. Is that, and you described it as traditional. Is it really traditional, or was it introduced by the Christian missionaries? And perhaps
a combination of the two. It is a combination of, I think, 3 things. One, I think that there was homosexual practice in pre-colonial African societies, In some places, it was even condoned in certain parts of Uganda, and there are researchers to do that. I have always wondered, why are mainstream Ugandans actually hostile to homosexuality? I personally think that if a person who grew up in rural Uganda or urban Uganda never heard of homosexuality, that a man can get sexual excitement from a fellow man or a woman from a fellow woman, the first time they hear it, they think it's a wrong thing. That is, I think, the first reaction. I tend to think that beyond Christianity and tradition is just people. I don't know whether this is a very arrogant thing for me to say. I think that most people really are very simplistic. They don't seek to understand the complexity of a problem. They look at its simplicity. Because people say, this is an unnatural thing. I ask them, what do you mean by nature? You see, I think that it is a combination of many things. And often Christianity is just used instrumentally to service. Christianity and tradition are evoked to service a deeply entrenched ignorance or prejudice. I don't know whether I'm clear. You can subtract Christianity out of Uganda and pull out tradition. Those two things, and you will find that people are hostile to homosexuality. Because Ugandan society is not sexually explicit. For most people, the discussion that the men should marry fellow men and women should marry fellow women is alien to them. It's not something they have grown in a culture that has talked about it and said it's okay. So they have to find an excuse or an explanation. How do I explain this wrong thing? They say, oh, my Christian values tell me it's wrong. Or they swing and say, traditionally it is an African. What do you mean? I asked them, what do you mean it's an African? It did not exist in pre-colonial society. Oh, if it did not exist, then it means African societies do not have any position on it.
I'm going to interrupt with one question here.
Yes.
This is the privilege of holding the mic. You mentioned the importance of existential threats, and I wonder if you'd qualify that at all, because the life expectancy of the average African president is not terribly long. Indeed, the life expectancy of an African president is probably lower than any other president on the planet. And if that wasn't clear in 1962, it was certainly clear by 1966, and it's very clear by now. So this certainly suggests that an existential threat, whether it's a coup or civil war, is not a sufficient condition. It may not even be, in my mind, a necessary condition for the most successful and the most fastest and most sustained growth in the history of the human civilization is Botswana. And perhaps this is my ignorance of Botswana, but I don't see the existential threat, certainly not today. So perhaps to HIV/AIDS, but that's of a different character. So I wonder if you'd speak to that.
Botswana. You see, beyond existential threats, I also talked about the role of individual and organizational agency. I think that in countries that have low levels of institutional development, the role of individuals in the destiny of those nations is extremely important, because individuals can make many things happen. And in the case of Botswana, the group that captured power at independence was led by the king. So he enjoyed overwhelming legitimacy. The king of the Tswana, who constitutes 84% of the population, enjoyed overwhelming legitimacy. So there was no threat to his power, really. Two, the coalition he built to govern Botswana was a coalition of traditional ranchers. These were people who had property. So they had a vested interest in a polity that would support increasing returns to their investment. And a combination of those two, his legitimacy, his individual character, and the kind of organization and the pillars of that organization was responsible for sustaining robust political institutions and public policies. The same happened to Kenya in the Kenyatta period. The Kikuyu who captured power at independence were extremely propertied, and they had a vested interest in promoting the productivity of their private investments. But in many African countries, the elites that captured power after independence and after came from dispossessed and disgruntled groups, and they looked at the state as an instrument of redistributing the wealth, expropriating those who owned the wealth, largely Lebanese in West Africa, Asians in East Africa, and European multinational capital. So the social base of the regime, or the political base of the regime, if it's the veranda boys that are supporting the regime, of course, it will pursue wrong policies. And when the political social base of a regime is a property class, it will tend to be much more productive. You could also see it partly in Ivory Coast under Sir Felix, Mr. Felix Houphouët-Boigny, the first president. So that is one. So it's agency, it's the social base of elites who are ruling. It is the level of the mobilization of different groups. In most of these countries, really, the business class or the productive classes are not very well mobilized, but you may find ethnic identities are better mobilized, and they are demanding redistributive policies. It's a combination of so many things, but overall is that when aid comes into a system that has already become dysfunctional, where politics is organized around a neo-Patrimonio logic, it tends to accentuate rather than to ease the problems. Now, about the existential threat. In 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed and Western countries started pulling out aid from most of the nations of Africa. The consequence was that most regimes in Africa actually became vulnerable. In Benin, Matthew Karuku was vulnerable. In Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya, all these regimes all of a sudden become extremely vulnerable. Many of them were forced into political reform. Others who could not reform did not have money without foreign aid to finance their armies. They collapsed under the weight of civil war in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. Others, their armies mutinied and they suffered military coups. So we can clearly see that any regime in financial decay is also a regime at political risk. And the most important thing we should never do is to get such regimes that are in financial decay and give them a subsidy from abroad. We should let them sink.
Can you suggest, let's say, 3 good foreign aid projects that you would recommend if you were asked?
Well, I should recommend them in this context, that if you find a system that is functional, if you go to Rwanda, they have a very functional state. So I would recommend that where you find things are working, you can use foreign aid to promote that achievement. You see, the problem with aid is attracted to our failures, not to our achievements. So it comes to fix our weaknesses, not to leverage our strength. And if you try to fix the weakness of anybody, I can tell you the changes you get will be extremely minimal at best, but you will tend to accentuate that dysfunction, because whenever you find dysfunctional institutions, you know that there are powerful individuals who are benefiting out from this dysfunction, and putting more money into a dysfunctional institution will be like pouring water into a bottomless pit. So that is one. The second thing is even within nations that are characterized by dysfunction, because governments are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. You may find small pockets of efficiency in an ocean of incompetence. Identify that which is innovative, that government department that is innovative, and support that. Wherever you see failure, run away. Wherever you see success, support. I think that aid should reward innovation. It should never subsidize failure. Finally, I think that you can use aid as venture capital. I think that we should, in most cases where you have dysfunctional state institutions, aid should, as far as possible, seek innovative private sector and civil society actors and sidestep the state.
Do you have some specific examples of things that have worked?
One of the examples that have worked in terms of aid, quite a number. There are so many. Small little aid projects may have delivered medicine in one village, food in another, or built a hospital and a clinic, a borehole. So many aid projects have worked in many places. My argument always is that the problem of the aid industry is to look at one aid project that has succeeded, try to transplant that experience or that success across so many countries and regions, across so many cultures, ignoring the unique conditions, habits, norms, values, skills that were unique and peculiar to that village, and try to spread them across the whole third world, thinking that they're the experience of everybody. You see, aid will be extremely effective if it was selective and particular. Aid would be extremely effective if it was not given because a country is poor, but if it was given because somebody is innovating something, somebody is doing something right. You see, the qualification for getting aid is that you are poor. I think that's a very wrong qualification. The qualification should be, are you doing something right? How can we support it? Are you doing something wrong? Or we will not touch it, because never indulge yourself in dysfunction. If you find a young boy here gambling in the casino, spending his the money on the credit card on bars and the cocaine, and you give them more money for them to buy better clothes when they are going to transfer it to cocaine again and to gambling in the casino, that will not be a formula for success. But if you find a young kid here, extremely innovative, trying to set up a business or do some, interesting, innovative and creative things, support that one. So I believe in rewarding achievement and innovation and penalizing failure and incompetence. Yes, sir.
Well, my question was going to be to ask about your thoughts on the merits of aid, of conditional aid, that is, aid that's rewarded after the fact, conditional upon institutional reforms. I think you've sort of just addressed that. So I'll ask a related question. And is what do you see as the potential of aid to be an inducement for institutional reform? So of all the factors that contribute towards institutional reform, will we be able to point towards cases of conditional aid, that is, aid delivered after the fact, conditional upon institutional reform, as a mechanism for institutional reform?
Well, to answer your question, I think I should have said something I forgot to say. That aid works in extremely rare and exceptional circumstances that are very difficult to find and difficult to recreate. Rare to find and difficult to recreate. In that case, aid can actually spur institution building, but that requires a convergence of different, but at least compatible interests between the aid giver and the aid recipient. I'll give you an example of Uganda. In 1987, when our current government came into office, the current president inherited a collapsed state and a collapsed economy. He clearly understood that his ability to consolidate his position in power was entirely dependent on accessing money to put basic goods and services in shops. Sugar, soap, salt, and water, these things you take for granted here were luxuries in Uganda because the entire industrial sector had collapsed. That is one. Two, state institutions were totally dysfunctional. So for him to consolidate his position, he needed to deliver goods and services in shops. But the economy had also collapsed. He didn't have foreign exchange to import soap and sugar and salt and the ordinary things, really, kerosene. And he realized he went to get money from the international aid community. They insisted that we can only give you aid if you reach an agreement with the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank said we can only give you money if you accept liberal reform. Disband state enterprises, disband state monopolies, deregulate the economy, liberalize the foreign exchange market, things like that. Initially, he accepted these conditionalities out of desperation rather than out of conviction. But in accepting these conditionalities, he got money. But Uganda you see, these cases are extremely unique, that in the sense that in Uganda, you had a bureaucracy of the state that was actually in favor of these reforms and building of these functional institutions. And you had a political class that was hostile to it. But the moment this bureaucracy leveraged that power and used this reform to generate economic growth, it was very quick for the political class to see that it is better to hold a small slice of a growing pie, than hold a huge slice of a shrinking one. Rather than control an entire state that is whose economy is collapsing or collapsed, it's better to hold a very small slice of a state that is able to grow the economy. So a combination of a bureaucratic core that favored these reforms and institution building, a very pragmatic president who was willing to, to take a chance, was able to create a modicum that allowed the early construction of institutions in Uganda, which right now he's working very hard to destroy. So, but that is, you need a combination of many different factors. So you can see in that case there was a convergence of interests, but they were different. The donors wanted these reforms, the government wanted money for something else, totally to consolidate its position in power. I think that aid works when a government's desire to hold and retain power requires it to do those things that are of the greatest benefit to its citizens. When that kind of convergence of the interests of power align with the interests of the citizen, then aid can be an extremely functional instrument of development policy.
Hi. So you just mentioned that Museveni is potentially destroying the institutions of Uganda. And I was curious if you thought that he'll have any serious threats in the upcoming 2011 election to his political power.
Yeah, he has significant threats. 70% of the Ugandan population is angry with him. So that's a very big threat. Okay, I know that this opposition does not find organized political expression because he has bought of all elites. So he has disconnected the head from the body. The head meaning elite leadership from the body, which is ordinary people followership. In any system, you have followership and leadership. By creating the largest neo-Patrimonio order you can imagine on the African continent, he has 114 presidential advisors. He has cabinet ministers, 71 cabinet ministers. He has 189 commissions and semi-autonomous government bodies. And he's dividing the country into small units of local government. Here you call them states, in Uganda we call them districts. He has now created 104 districts. A few years ago, there were about 56. Now they are growing every day, and the district has a parliament, it has an executive, it has a civil service, a bureaucracy. So it creates so many jobs for elites. All these elites are integrated into his patronage system that is financed by aid and soon will be financed by oil. So the thing is that in a country with few educated people, outside of the state and the market, there are few elites with skills and experience and a national profile to build an effective opposition movement. He has, I think that although the masses, 70% oppose him, they do not have an organization through which their discontent can be expressed. So they remain fragmented in rural areas and unable really to have a say on the national political process. And when it comes to voting, he steals the votes. But if the opposition find momentum, something around which they can rally, I can tell you they will give him a run for his money.
How useful do you feel it is for the very small individual AIDS projects? For example, a Finca, F-I-N-C-A, that makes very small business loans to individuals, particularly women, or Heifer International that provides chickens or a cow or whatever to individuals. How useful do you see that as a way of giving aid down to people as opposed to governments?
Actually, I'm against aid largely to governments. I think that aid like that is people-to-people aid, I think is always functional because, first of all, it's small scale, so people can pull out if they think it's not working. It's very difficult when governments have engaged to disengage. So I think that's a very good thing. Most of this people-to-people aid, most of it, not all of it, tends to support innovative things.
Hey, thank you very much for your talk so far. So I have a couple of questions. What are your thoughts on the involvement of China in Africa as far as aid goes? Because I mean, historically, it seems most of it has been from the West so far. And my second question is, in your ideal world, is it that you envision absolutely no aid to governments, period, irrespective of whether the government is dysfunctional or well-running? Is it like absolutely no aid to government? And like, what's the way forward? Do you just recommend completely just stopping things right now? Or like, what would your ideal world be?
So I'm going to give you an extremist answer. I think that if I was a donor, I would say I'm going to be scaling down aid by 20% to most governments in Africa. Most, not all. That is the first thing, because I think that most of them are really dysfunctional. I would begin mercilessly cutting it, and in 5 years, they will be facing a serious crisis. Now, as I said in the beginning, there are always exceptions to the rule. I would identify either entire governments. I have given you one example, the government of Rwanda, which I think I would not even get involved in what they do. I will give them budget support. Decide what you do with the money, because they know how to use it well anyway. The incentive structure is different. 2, within dysfunctional governments, I identify those pockets that work. If you come to Uganda, the central bank, the revenue authority, the Ministry of Finance, they are fairly competent and autonomous institutions. So I would support those government institutions in those countries where I think they are functional. If I went to Kenya and Uganda and Ghana and Nigeria, in terms of healthcare delivery. They have functional public-private sector systems that can deliver actual education and health. I would possibly create a voucher system through which the government would, I would try to deliver aid through private sector initiatives rather than through dysfunctional public institutions. You see, my approach is that I need to be particular to the experience. If you ask me, how do we give aid to Zambia? I want to study Zambia's political economy. How does its civil society work? Is it corrupt? Is it efficient? How does its, how is its private sector? Is it competent? If you ask me about Congo, Mobutu's Congo, I don't even think that there is a private sector there you can use to deliver healthcare. Possibly it is there and I don't know. But largely I need to understand the internal properties of a given country and use those internal properties. Or to put it the other way, it is important to appreciate the social endowments of a given nation before you design the aid architecture for it. The aid architecture must be specific to that country's social endowments. Some countries are very good through private sector initiatives. Follow the private sector. Others have powerful civil society groups. Use those ones. Others have strong and effective states. Use those state institutions. Others have dysfunctional states, but there are pockets of efficiency in those. Some departments that are functional, use those that are functional.
I think there was another part of the question about China. Did we?
China. Regarding China, you see, I don't think that Africa's solutions lie with China, Europe, or anywhere. They lie within Africa itself. Africa's inability to benefit from external interactions is a product of its own internal incoherencies. So for me, really, whether it is, there's nothing China can do that can change Africa, and there's nothing the West can do that can change Africa, except to do nothing. If they did nothing, they would promote progressive change. But if the internal conditions within Africa are ripe, then Africa can leverage the institutional or policy strength it has mastered internally to leverage its external relations and get something out of it. So if governments remain as corrupt and incompetent as they are, it does not matter how much money China puts in.
I have a two-part question. The first is, along with foreign aid comes, the push for foreign cultural and social norms, in particular human rights. And I know Uganda has a human rights commission. I've worked with them a couple times. And I was just wondering, what do you think is the role of the Uganda Human Rights Commission? Do you think it's an effective tool of actually being a watchdog against the government? And second of all, do you think that there is a culture of rights that exists in Uganda?
Uganda is a country in transition, so the culture of rights that exists is one that is growing. There is a growing culture of... Remember that never forget what Karl Marx called the catalytic function of ideas. Ideas on human rights have spread across the whole world, and people have embraced them as their own. So in Uganda, people will promote human rights, not because they will not argue that they have been influenced by the West, although that may be the fact, but they have embraced and internalized these human rights issues. Regarding the Uganda Human Rights Commission, I think it is partly independent and partly, this is the contradiction about Uganda. You see, sometimes it tends to exhibit independence and try to hold the state to account on human rights, but sometimes it also acts as a public relations arm of the government when it wants to hide its public relations, rather its human rights violations. So I cannot really give an answer that it is this or that. Its situation is much more complex depending on the moment and the intensity of the issue it is dealing with.
I had a quick question about, I wanted to see are you familiar with the Global Fund Country Coordinating Mechanism method of allocating aid from the Global Fund within a country?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that as compared to bilateral donors?
You see, the Global Fund, are you talking about the Global Fund for tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria? If you go to Rwanda, you'll be amazed at how effective they have used Global Fund aid. Effective. If you come to Uganda, we stole all of it. I don't know whether you know. They gave us 240 million, the bureaucrats, civil servants, and the politicians. They formed NGOs, collected the money. They bought prime real estate in New York, in Johannesburg, in London, when people here in New Haven can't afford to buy the real estate here. And all the money was stolen, and the sick and dying remained on their beds. So I don't think there is any international architecture you can design that is blind to these peculiarities. In fact, they argued in Uganda that they will not deliver global fund money through the state. They will use the state to give it to private organizations who can do the work. But what happened is incumbents within the state organized, registered hurriedly private organizations who came and collected this money. So the organization of a country's politics is very important. The government of Uganda had long lost an interest in fighting AIDS and now was interested in using aid as an instrument of patronage. And that's what they did. The supporters of the regime and a few opponents were able to go and, form organizations and pick the money. Did you have you had a...
Sorry, I would just ask as a follow-up to that, I mean, it does have the audit mechanism built in and the risk, this very real threat of losing the funding that most donors like USA is really bad at following through on that.
Does it work? I should tell you, in Uganda, they suspended the funding. You know why? Because the Minister of Health in Uganda refused. The wife of the director of the Global Fund in Geneva represented the company that was selling malaria drugs. So they wanted to create a contract that all malaria drugs should be bought from her, the company she represented. You see, the Minister of Health in Uganda had been, I think, given something big by, or whatever it was, he refused. When he refused, Geneva sent in an audit. The audit found that all this money had actually been stolen. It is because, remember, by the way, that the international aid bureaucracy itself, wherever it is corrupt. So the wife of the director of the Global Fund wanted to get this deal. When Uganda blocked, said, okay, we will also, you have, hit us this side, we will hit you the other side. So they sent in PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is an international audit firm, which came and audited and found that all this money really was going to politicians and civil servants and regime clients. So they immediately suspended the aid. But the Ugandan side also revealed, said, but no, you are attacking us because we refuse to allow your company to supply us malaria drugs. So the guy there had to resign. So in this case, the Global Fund was able to act in Uganda because the international and the local were unable to align their interests. Had they aligned them, I can promise you they would never have exposed the data.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
A broader question, almost a historical one. You talked about ethnic rivalries, ethnic heterogeneity in Africa. Is it, first of all, is it a problem that has been overstated? Second of all, is it a problem going back to Western colonialism, as we learn here in our schools, drawing arbitrarily the borders on the maps the colonialists had, and if the borders would have been drawn differently, would it have been a totally different Africa, with more stability and more prosperity?
For the first two questions, they are both right. One, that I think the problem of ethnicity is overstated. Two, that the colonial administrative innovations had something to do with it. But what I think is most important is that what you consider ethnicity and tribalism today is as modern and as current as what is happening on that day. Because people have their identities, but if I want to get access to power, I need something that can help me create an emotional following around me. I can see in America here, you have people who organize as Christian conservatives or something like that. Sometimes they can even vote against their own economic interest in pursuit of some emotive ideological aim or religious objective. So I think that anyone who can easily strategize and call themselves the leading Christian in America can easily win over that constituency. I have seen politicians in this country pander to the Christian right in order to win its vote. So even in Africa, politicians would want to invent even non-existent ethnic tensions in order to rally a given community to stand behind them. And it's current right now in Uganda, because Uganda spends 44% of its budget at the level of the local government, the state level, what you call states here. Half the budget almost goes to those districts. So, but how can any community justify having a district? They say, for us, our tribe is this. There are tribes that never existed in pre-colonial and colonial Uganda, which have been invented in the last 5 years, just to get a district. So you can see what is an identity. An identity is something that you can pull out of the air and say, now we are Banyala, we want our own district. Now we are Baruli, now we are Yelians, tomorrow we are Harvardians. So new groups are cropping up, new ethnicities and clans are being born in Uganda today in order to have an own district so that they can access, central government resources. So that is the thing. The last question was? Arbitrary borders. I'm not particularly attracted to it for one reason. If you were to create nations in Africa around a tribe, these nations, some of them, there are tribes in Africa which have 50,000 people. So Africa would become a continent of not less than 9,000 states. So to be honest with you, as an African, I personally think that colonialism made a significant improvement on Africa. Out of a group of not less than 6,000 groups, it created at least 53 nations. And since that time, we have added more rather than reduced them. So we have not fostered more unity, in fact. We added on Eritrea since colonialism left. That is one. The second thing is that even historically, there are no borders that were ever negotiated with the people. States are created through conquest. Wherever generals fought and won the war is where they press the border. So even the borders of France, you know that Napoleon was born in an island of Corsica, which France had captured from Italy, one of those Italian states, either Venetia, Lombardy, or whatever it was, just a few years before Napoleon was born. You see, in America here, there was the Missouri Purchase by Thomas Jefferson. America then fought Mexico and got Texas and Florida, things like that. Borders are forced. Borders are creations of conquest. There is no meeting where they say, okay, for me, I will fall into this country. And the other one, Woodrow Wilson tried it after the First World War, and you can see how disastrous it was as an experiment of, what do they call it, self-determination. So I think that argument is really not rooted in history. The history of all borders is a history of conquest. And Africa was created, most of the states of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, were created through colonial conquest. Now, the subjective effects of the colonial state in Africa were disastrous on those who lived under it. It was racist, it was exploitative, it was oppressive, it was all bad, many bad things. But the objective outcome of the colonial project was to integrate many of those countries into the international system and actually create some modicum of a modern state. What Africa should be discussing is not the ills of colonialism, but how to leverage the minimum advantages the colonial state left behind. Much more viable entities of political administration. The colonial government left us, in many countries in Africa, left us important bureaucratic traditions that if we built upon, would foster economic growth and the well-being of African citizens. Botswana is the prime example. It built a lot on the functional bureaucratic traditions, ethics and rules that were left behind by the British colonial government. So, yeah. Thank you very much.